Epiphany, celebrated January 6th each year, originated in the 3rd century Eastern Orthodox Church in honor of the baptism of Christ, sometimes also in connection with the Nativity. Over the centuries, the Western Church separated Christ's baptism and Epiphany into different holy days. The Western Church began celebrating the Feast of Epiphany in the 4th century. However, instead of Christ's baptism, they associated the holy day with the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles, represented by the Magi. Many of us also think of an epiphany as a sudden revelation or insight, an aha, kite flying in a thunderstorm, waiting for a lightning bolt to strike, moment of clarity or enlightenment. The funny thing about that sense of epiphany is that those aha moments rarely happen without some time, perhaps a great deal of time, spent journeying to that pinnacle. Sometimes an epiphany takes a lifetime. A profound realization of truth, of oneness with everything, is usually the result of a long journey and lots of inner work. Like the Magi, we must make an arduous and sometimes dangerous trip to discover Christ's consciousness already incubating within. The Magi weren't merely wise men, by the way. They were the Persian Empire's high council, profoundly religious, extremely intelligent, and well-educated. They created Persia's civil laws and were solely responsible for choosing the next Persian king. So, it is a delegation of Persian kingmakers, definitely traveling with a caravan and all the oriental pomp and circumstance of the era, that go to see Herod. It's not just 3 guys on some donkeys. King Phraates of Persia sends his secretaries of state and an impressive entourage to make a political statement. That they were seeking a Jewish baby was significant and rightfully threw Herod into a panic. Rome and Persia were not friendly. Territorial skirmishes were frequent and anti-Roman sentiment was high in the region. The arrival of the Magi was Persia's way of saying they supported Jewish, not Roman, authority over the region. Yet, even though politics drove the Magi to Bethlehem, I think their motive changed once they saw Jesus. I think they, too, have an epiphany. The Magi knew that war was coming with Rome sooner, not later. And in fact, it would start about 3 years after Jesus' birth. An infant king wasn't going to help their immediate issues with the empire. Yet, still, we read that the Magi bowed, offered gifts, and worshipped the presence not of a newborn king, as the Bible somewhat erroneously reports, but of the God of the Jews they already knew so well. Daniel was the only non-hereditary Magi, and Judaism played an important role in Persian religion and culture. The Magi undertook a journey seeking a king, but instead they found God, vulnerable, in a manger, as sharp a political and theological statement as God has ever made. As so often happens on a long journey of self-discovery, the Magi made the decision to turn away from Herod, who represents the oppression and politics of empire, and instead head out in a new, more spiritually attuned direction. What if we consider ourselves God's Magi? Like the Magi, we too are explorers. In fact, history shows we're elated to make a discovery by one route and return home by another. If we return home at all, since we've been leaving home and settling someplace new for the last 150,000 years. There are things to learn, discoveries to be made, epiphanies to be had, and part of the way is finding new roads and new homes altogether. From the time we could walk any distance without being eaten by a wild animal, we started exploring this world. Out of Africa, we spread across the entire globe, cataloging everything we discovered, preserving it for future generations. We astonished our children with stories of distant lands, of lives spent adventuring. We drew crude pictures of exotic animals, first through spoken word, and then in manuscripts, codices, and books. We recorded our experiments, our meanderings, our longings. We discovered tools, cooking, building, reading, math, medicine, and philosophy. We created civilizations. Each of those discoveries, epiphanies along the way, enable us to understand today that much of the information we gather is stored genetically and passed from generation to generation. Exploration and the knowledge it imparts are encoded into us. We've been exploring for over 150,000 years. And still, we wonder why we're here and what the point is, if any, to being alive. We seek more in-depth and meaningful answers to our existential questions by sending our mechanical magi into space in hopes of meeting other seekers of knowledge. We continue to follow the light of the stars and hope they will guide us to God. Like the Magi, we too are on a spiritual journey toward oneness with singular universal consciousness. Perhaps the purpose of being human is to explore, not just our physical world, but also what it means to be human. From those willing to be crucified for others to those willing to kill for power. What if each of us, the crucifier, crucified, and everything in between, are on journeys of discovery for God? What if being and all the things we learn and do throughout our lives is part of an infinite array of information gathering for God, the meta-consciousness of all realities? Each of us is a magus on a journey toward epiphany. And because we are explorers of and in universal consciousness, every story in our lives is automatically shared with the originating explorer, God. More than the revelation of Christ to the Gentiles, the Magi's story speaks to the heart of what it means to be human, the Spirit of God consciousness having a physical experience. That's what being human is, physical God consciousness. We are God's Magi, sent across universes and realities to live without boundaries, to question everything, and to have a lifetime full of epiphanies. Amen. My question for you today, my friends, is what have you discovered as one of God's Magi? What have you discovered as one of God's Magi? I'll send you into breakout rooms for a few moments so you just can discuss. If somebody would please take some notes while you're in the breakout room so that when we get back together with the full group, we can share discussions with each other. I would appreciate that. I don't know what's wrong with my mouth this morning. I apologize. So thank you for your presence, and I hope you enjoy your meetings.